How can we best support and mentor our colleagues? What are the best practices and strategies coming out of feminist pedagogies? How can we bring the critical insights of scholars to our own work and our scholarly communities? Welcome to the Virtual Jewel Box podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm Scott Black, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and today I am delighted to welcome Dr. Leandra Hernández and Dr. Omi Salas-SantaCruz, who will be talking about Dr. Hernández's new book, Queer, Women of Color, and Critical Approaches to Feminist Mentorship and Pedagogy, which Dr. Hernández co-edited with Stevie Munns and Jessica Paul. Dr. Hernández is Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Utah, who works on queer critical and Chicana feminist health and media studies. Dr. Salas-SantaCruz is Assistant Professor in the Department of Education, Culture, and Society at the University of Utah, who works on decolonial theory, transgender studies, borderlands theory, and critical race studies. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much for having us.
Welcome, Omi.
Thank you. Let me start by saying this book grabbed me right away. Mentorship has been complicated in my own life. I had some really bad mentors.
Oh, no.
Yeah, unfortunately. Mentors who were more about gatekeeping than about care. And because of that, I tried to do the opposite. But doing the opposite, to be honest, is not quite easy. I needed a practical guide, and in many ways, this book was that guide for me. So I appreciate the intervention.
Of course. And thank you for being here with me today for the conversation. I'm just so excited to talk about all of these things with you.
Yeah. So one of the first things in the book, it talks about expectations and desires. The chapter on testimonio, for example. The idea that we can name what we want from and with each other. Mm-hmm. It's so simple, yet it's quite radical and necessary when we're talking about mentorship. So I was really moved by how the collection of chapters, it's grounded in both Black feminist and Chicana Latina feminist traditions, specifically because it reminded me of the kinds of mentorship that I grew up with, especially the mentorship of my grandmother, for example, right? And not so much about intellectual growth, but nurturing and care. Yes. So for me, in this book, even though I'm a professor of philosophy and theory, it's pretty much a lived practice. Mm-hmm. And it's, in many ways, the words that I use to describe this is sanctuary, comadrisma, in your own words, ecological webs, testimonio. And for me, these things show us that mentorship is just this radical feminist community-rooted practice that we kind of know something about, but don't quite yet know how to practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it.
So this is why I'm really, excited to be invited into this conversation. So I want to start there. What inspired you and your co-editors to make mentorship the center of this book?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because even your point earlier about naming what we need and then making it happen and going after it, that is actually quite literally what happened with this book. So this book is connected to an earlier co-edited book that Stevie and Jessica and I published in 2023 called Feminist Mentoring in Academia. And the book stems from a complaint building on Sarah Ahmed's notion of complaint as feminist pedagogy. And it was also our own collective approach to institute, or at least try to enact, some sort of institutional change. So at a previous institution where we were all connected, we found out about this moment, this instance, this complaint, this grievance. And then in trying to figure out how to navigate that institutionally, we inevitably ended up forging radical feminist friendships, networks of mentorship and solidarity. We leaned on our own external mentors, not just in academia, but in other spaces as well, to help us navigate the process. And we learned so much about what it means to mentor and be mentored, what it means to be connected by trust and to be vulnerable. And we also learn too about the power of collective organizing as a long-term strategy, right? And I really mean long-term. I think oftentimes when we need to enact some sort of change, we feel like it has to happen immediately. And this process at a micro level of navigating the issues, but also at a macro level of publishing the book, that took years, right? And in many ways, this is still an ongoing process. So for all of our colleagues out there who are feeling some of these struggles and woes, I remind you, as I remind myself every day, change takes time, right? It's the little micro level daily practices that help us get there. And, along the way, we learned a lot about the woes and the struggles and some of the failures of mentorship too. So really the book is rooted in that. And I always joke with our graduate students that I'm a kitchen sink scholar. And when I was in graduate school, I remember telling my committee chair, I want to do intersectionality and reproductive justice and health comm and media studies. And he's like, Leah, honey, that's the kitchen sink. I need you to focus on one plate or one utensil. And I didn't have the words back then to articulate it, but I do now. And something that I always tell folks is that, many of us don't live single issue lives. Therefore, we can't really just use a single issue theory or method to think about the world or our burning questions. And the reason I mention that here is to go back to your question about what inspired the book. Most of my work recently has been focusing on pedagogy and mentorship, and perhaps less so on some of my other traditional research. And I kept being haunted by these questions of what it means to actually be an academic or to do academia, right? Like, what does it mean to focus on relationality and care and support and surviving and thriving, as opposed to maybe the more traditional approaches that have encouraged us to just focus on our research and get it done and get tenure. And as I was getting closer to getting my portfolio ready for tenure, I just kept saying, like, these questions are haunting me. I have to engage them. So that's why a lot of the work has been in this mentorship and pedagogy vein, and also advocating for more space for that in our research and in our tenure policies and et cetera, so that we don't just have to feel like we can only focus on research in one way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I hear you in the sense of the long-term process of cultivating
Yeah.
mentorship, right? And that kind of brings me to your chapter on comadrisma. And for the listeners, this is a word that comes from the Latina Chicana traditions of comadre. And it speaks of long-term cultivating friendships, right? Relationships, intimacy, accountability, and cultural grounding.
Yeah.
Right. So it's more of a reciprocal relationship than the top-down sort of understanding of guidance and mentorship, right? That we see in academia. So you describe comadrisma as trust, vulnerability, and care. For me, it gives me language to do something around naming that feeling that needs to be present in mentorship relationships, right? That it's like, oh, I'm cultivating this relationship around or with the comadres, right? So in many sense, right, I have a compadre myself, and that's a relationship that I built not just in community, but around certain expectations of care and trust. So I wanted to ask you about, can you share a little bit about what you mean with comadrisma as mentorship or a model of mentorship, and what experiences or tradition lead you to use this framework specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with thinking about how we came to it and the experiences or traditions before I hop to the definition. And this concept has really grown in collaboration with my best friend, my sister scholar, Dr. Sarah de los Santos Upton at the University of Texas in El Paso. And I love telling this story. It's so funny because it's so out of the ordinary, but it also highlights how wonderful serendipity can be sometimes. Because, Sarah and I are both Chicana feminist borderland scholars, but we weren't really connected in a lot of the same conference networks or spaces the way other folks might have. So we were actually at a separate conference in our field, OSCLG, or Organization for the Study of Communication, Language, and Gender. I think this was in 2013. And she came up to me after my panel and said, I really like your hair. And I said, oh my goodness, I love your hair, because we have similar hair, just different curl patterns. And we became good friends and best friends and collaborators, and then quite literally sisters afterwards. And so much of our shared work together has focused on, like, first our scholarship started by talking about feminicidios and gender violence at the US-Mexico border. But then when we realized that we needed to take a moment and shift from focusing so much on violence and focusing more on joy, this is when we started to think about other scholarship we could work on, like comadrisma. So in some of our earlier work, we've explored comadrisma as a concept and praxis, which is really rooted, like you noted, right, in like our own experiences of Latinidad and Chicana feminist praxis. It stems from our collaborative research and our friendship, namely with Sarah as a mother and me as a child-free individual, and us trying to make sense of our own experiences in higher education related to how to balance and manage being a parent on the 10-year clock, how child-free individuals can show up for parents or those with other family formations and conference spaces. Like, how can we think about trading off on authorship on publications or bringing in more folks to the collaborative so we can publish more meaningfully, alternate author roles. Like if Sarah says, oh my goodness, my child is sick, I can't meet this deadline, I can say, I can step in for you, we'll still get it done, right? And a fun fact, Sarah has 3 children, all 3 of whom were born after each one of our books was published. And I mean within like 1 week. So we always joke that Sarah and I birthed a book and then she birthed a human, and we birthed a co-edited book and then she birthed a human, right? So her children were with us every step of the way. And thinking about comadrisma really helps us think about how Spanish to English and vice versa translations don't really always capture the essence of the word, right? So when we thought about comadre, which literally translates to co-mother, that's when we were thinking about how this could be utilized as a lens or a theoretical framework for how we practice mentorship with each other. And it's also rooted in our own lived experiences as, you know, Mexican-American women born and raised in Texas, and really seeing our abuelas' relationships with their best friends, our mothers, godmothers, right? And then our madrinas or our godmothers who were best friends with our mothers, right? So it's also this very real witnessing of the power of friendship and solidarity in the notion of, you know, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to raise an academic. It takes a village for us to get tenure. And those were all of the same ideas that we had there. So it really is rooted in collective care, support, and solidarity that seeks to push back against academic norms that devalue care work and love and support. So in our very first chapter that we wrote about, where we were laying out the groundwork for this, we included a picture of us at a conference where Sarah had her daughter Isabel sitting on the conference table with us while we were presenting, and then we would just trade off. So one of us could be talking, one of us could be engaging, one of us could be feeding Isabel or, you know, changing her diaper or whatever the case may be. And that's just one example of how we think about mentorship in our lived experience, but really to think about how comadrisma can offer a space for healing, right? Or to honor our vivencias in ways that academia typically has excluded or even worse, dehumanized.
I love that. And, you know, as I'm hearing you speak, I actually have a comadrisma relationship with Dr. Claudia Garcia Luis at UT San Antonio, Texas.
See?
She invited me to a writing retreat at her home with other colleagues. And I think we had the power outages at the glitches in the airport, and I was the only one that made it.
Oh, no.
So her kids were at home, and her child just wanted to play and swim. And I was seeing how, you know, she needed to do a lot of work and just focus on her writing and whatnot. So I said, you know what? I got this. Yeah. So I jumped in the pool, and I was that babysitter for the week.
Yeah, there you go.
And you know what? That actually enabled me to write some more when I got back. Even though I did not spend my time writing, I was there co-parenting for that week and seeing how she needed that kind of support for the writing. And to me, I'm like, you know, I'm hearing you talk, and now I have language, right? That we're doing this mentorship as a co-mothering, and it's just very powerful to hear you say, you know, the different practices that can come up. Yeah. And I think this leads me to my next question, that if a university embrace this notion of comadrisma, what might look different in the culture or in the policies or in the way we just engage with students and other faculty.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much. So the chapter in the book that we talk about focuses on comadrisma as like a writing mentorship strategy, right? And this is one chapter or one iteration of the larger framework that we're swimming in and making sense of. And that was really rooted in some of our own machista, patriarchal experiences in the academy with reviews where men would have certain comments. And we knew they were men because they would tell us that they were men. And they would have certain comments about like the language we were using or the arguments we were making. Also, just other disproportionate levels of labor at conference service spaces and things of that nature. So the chapter in the book specifically offers 5 contours in relation to that context, but I have more thoughts too. So the framework is essentially trying to challenge essentialism in our disciplines and academic spaces, think creatively about how to write intersectionality and how to empower all members of the research process. So none of this, like, we're going to have an RA, you're going to do a lot of the work, but you're not going to get publication. We're not doing that anymore. Other people shouldn't do it either.
Right.
But that's another hill for another podcast episode. Breaking apart from and resisting gatekeeping processes, altering historical traditions of language dominance, and then also trying to enact feminist solidarity in confronting and resisting these histories. Now, I mentioned already that this is just one iteration, right? But when I think about what that means for us in higher education, I want to continue advocating for educators and collaborators to use ethics of care in their scholarship, right? Like so often, and necessarily so, our models and frameworks focus on doing no harm to participants. And I say necessarily so because we always need to be mindful of that. But we don't really talk that much about what it means to do no harm to each other in the writing process when we're trying to develop relationships with each other, research collaboratives, and et cetera. And this ethic of care really does inform our entire approach to higher ed, like how we mentor each other, how we write with each other, how we navigate the publication process together. And also in thinking about like what this means maybe for organizers or people who are wearing multiple hats, right? This same ethic of care can be applied there, especially with organizing goals and otherwise, trying to recognize that our bodies can only do so much at any given moment, especially now. So a comadrisma ethic can help us think about how we can best share the love and the labor to achieve whatever sort of social change we're after. And that's one of the questions that continues to lie at the heart of like multiple iterations of this framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hearing you talk about the ethic of care and the sharing of labor, and it really makes me think about precarity and the weight of labor, specifically when we think about women of color, queer, and trans faculty, who tend to kind of carry that extra weight a little bit more than others, right? So this brings me to talking about precarity. Faculty of color and queer and trans faculty are often expected to mentor far beyond what's fair. Meanwhile, students from marginalized backgrounds are in environments that are not built for them. And I see 2 chapters speaking a little bit about this, the chapter on marginal bodies, right? And the chapter by Mick Brewer, Scattered Bodies Swimming Upstream, which employs an ecological lens, right, to demonstrate how sexuality, place, and identity influence mentorship. So my question to you, if you can speak on these 2 chapters, what do they contribute to your understanding of precarity in mentorship? And if any, they complicate or complement comadrisma?
Yeah, I love that so much. And one of the things I love, just so I can say it right now, is how you're building on the threads in the chapters, which brings me so much joy. I wish I would have had this conversation before I wrote the conclusion. It's okay. We'll edit and update later, right? So Marginal Bodies by Pat Davis and Brittany Claudy and Mixed Chapters, Scattered Bodies Swimming Upstream, really illustrate how feminist mentorship, solidarity, and praxis can resist precarity, or at least offer a space of love and support and transformation in response to precarious times. Marginal Bodies is a really fascinating chapter with Pat, who is one of our advanced or senior scholars in our field, and Brittany, who started her work with Pat as an undergraduate student. And this was not just a little project that they did. I mean, together they created a project, Marginal Bodies, which was a social justice grant funded visual exhibition where they applied for funding. They rolled out this exhibition together, which was connecting the history of Black women's voice and representation to contemporary struggles for racial violence and justice in the wake of police brutality. So again, right, like if you're thinking about how an undergraduate is working on this project, there's just so much maturity and wisdom being shared there together between Pat and Brittany. And their work really highlights how Black feminist mentorship specifically can inform how we practice care and empathy in precarious times. And, they've stayed together, working and communicating very closely even after Brittany graduated. And it's only one model of many that shows how, times can feel heavy as they often do, but these mentorship relationships offer us survival and a space to thrive. And Mick's chapter is so fascinating too because his explores the politics of gay men in feminist mentorship. And his chapter was really trying to complicate and disentangle what it means to be a gay man in a feminist mentorship relationship and what that means really for feminist world making. And again, right, world making is another one of those themes that is swimming in the book. And his chapter gives us a heuristic that we can use to think about how mentorship couplings come together and how we can navigate somewhat perceived, maybe identities that one maybe wouldn't think would be in that space, although I wouldn't think that, but maybe others might. And Mick asks us to think about absence, isolation, invisibility, and disconnect, feelings that queer folks and feminist folks can feel together, and what it means to engage in coalition building to address precarity. And I really loved his chapter too, because so many of my own mentees and advisees are queer individuals, as I am myself. And one of my students, whom I love dearly, who is a gay white man, and he wouldn't mind if I said this because we talk about it all the time. Sometimes he says, I just want to be mindful that as a gay white man, I am not unloading all of my emotional labor on you all the time. And, I joke with him that I kind of feel like in our mentorship relationship, I'm like a queer tia or a queer auntie, right? So I'm like, if you have no one else to tell, you can, of course, tell me. But I also think that example raises the important question of boundaries, right? Like, what do boundaries look like in these mentorship spaces, particularly when we are all collectively trying to resist and live in times of precarity, but also trying to make sure that we ourselves are swimming and not drowning. So lots of metaphors there and lots to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think he brings this notion of ecological mentorship, that it's like, think bigger. Think of mentoring as a whole ecosystem. Not everyone can do everything for you. Yeah. And to me, like I definitely, this is one of my favorite chapters as a queer person myself. It really spoke directly to me. Mm-hmm. It reminded me that, we don't thrive alone. None of us thrive alone, right? And we grow through multiple relationships, through communities that sustain us, through informal relationships that we make, right, across our different aspects of our lives. And I wanted to ask you about the relationship perhaps between ecological mentorship as dealing with precarity, right, as a great way to deal with precarity, but also moving on to the chapter on dance parties at midnight, because that's where then the body and joy come into this kind of web of relationships, right? And I'm thinking really about, queer elderhood and celebration of survival, as this chapter talks about, right? So I'm like, they're part of this. I'm thinking for me, like my friends outside of academia and just going to dance, right? And going to celebrate. And it's like, oh, this is the type of mentorship I need right now that will sustain my, finishing my next publication, right? So it looks like, it feels that it's not relevant to academia, but it is in so many ways because it relates to joy, but also dealing with precarity and all these other things that really constrained thriving in the academy.
Oh, 100%. What I love so much about how you just asked that is it makes us remember that mentorship looks different and our needs look different depending on where we are, right? So like sometimes, and again, going back to your earlier point, obviously that sounds so clear, but then you have to say it and re-say it for it to really stick, right? Like sometimes mentorship for me looks like a venting session with the comadres, right? Sometimes mentorship is all of us going to dance or going to like curanderos so we can just get showered with some incense and just be in a space where we can like breathe and be together. So to start with your question, going back to Mick's ecological model, I'm also kind of thinking about that like at a meta level now, right? Because Mick engages with concepts of time, structure, both social, environmental, place and affect and relationship. And what he's really asking us to do here is to think about how we queer relationality, right? And I think that that's one of the most awesome theoretical and practical applications of the chapter because he is thinking about queering world making through queering relationality or through thinking about it differently, right? Like, how can we support each other where they need it? What does that process look like? And I think, too, in Chantel and Brian's chapter, that's how it comes up: queer dance parties at midnight. And let me just start by saying that it's also kind of fun to think about the relationships I have with folks in the book, right? I don't know Mick very well at all, but Chantel is one of my like closest friends in academia. She and I met several years ago. She's one of the most beautiful writers I know, and that probably came through in her chapter with Bryant. And Bryant was one of her undergraduate students now. So like a lot of our collaboratives in the book are featuring undergraduate voices, which is something that I just love so much. That was a side tangent. But in Chantel and Brian's chapter, they're really thinking, as you mentioned, about queer elderhood and queer connection and relationality as survival and joy. And the very first time I read Chantel's chapter, I just immediately started crying. And I remember writing back to her and saying, I don't have a lot of edits. It just touched me meaningfully. And I think it's wonderful. And I think the reason I became so emotional when I read it, and you could probably relate to this too, is because queer elderhood is something that so many queer folks miss out on, right? Like so many of us don't know our queer elders. Maybe they passed away before we got old enough to know them. Maybe they never got a chance to be fully out or fully themselves before they passed away. Like I remember at our AHAS meeting, and Anita asked, think about your queer elders, et cetera, et cetera. And I just remember thinking like, I don't know who in my family was a queer elder. I think I might be the first one who's out, which is sobering and kind of terrifying and also kind of sad, right? Because I think most of the queer connections I made along the way were through friends in higher education and friends in queer outdoor spaces. And Chantel's chapter with Bryant is specifically foregrounding the power of queer relationality and queer elderhood for the focus of joy. And as we know, in higher education, so much scholarship that engages with queer communities really uses a deficit model, right? Or it has historically. Like, here's all the things wrong with the queer community, et cetera, et cetera. But Chantel and Brian are deliberately flipping that script to highlight how queer joy is literally life-saving. And I use the term literally here. And I think it also connects to comadrisma and so many of the other chapters, because it notes how even in times of precarity, and especially in times of precarity, these sorts of connections help nurture us in ways that maybe we didn't expect, and also in ways that we may not be getting elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of my queer elders, and I actually think of my grandmother as a queer elder. In many ways, as a woman growing up in the 1930s, 40s, right? And she always talked to me about sexuality and pleasure. And she would always remind me, I'm like, the women in my time were not supposed to talk about this, but I'm going to talk to you about this. So, and she lowered her voice, right? And I was like, okay, we're talking about this. So in many ways, she was this queer elder to me.
Yeah.
And this whole notion of dancing, one of the ways we would connect is she would watch the Sábado Gigante and all the musical shows, right, on the weekends. And then she would sit, and she was in a wheelchair, and she would just dance right, on her wheelchair, and she's like, hold my hand. And so I also really tear up a little bit with about that chapter. And it's also reminded me of, like, the mentorship is not always just about guidance or survival, but also joy and and resistance
Yeah.
and living life, right? Sometimes we forget to live our lives when we're too caught up in the demands of the academy, whether they're demands for, students or finishing their degrees or dissertations, but also for us, right? Publications and getting tenure and then getting full professorship and so on. So yeah, it really made me think about my own life and dance floors as a site of sanctuaries. But also I was thinking about, I don't know if you read Maya Chapina's poetry on the Pulse nightclub, where she calls the dance floor a church for those rejected by community or family. So I was really touched by, this sort of the dance floor as a space for collective resistance and learning from each other and supporting each other. So I really appreciate that chapter as well. So Leah, how do you see joy and embodiment expanding feminist mentorship? And do you see joy connecting to frameworks like sanctuary?
Yeah. Oh, so let's speak about sanctuary. Selnisha Dangerfield's chapter on sanctuary was another one of those that when I first read it, it took my breath away. And just as another fun, like mentorship aside, I met Selnisha a few years ago, maybe 2022, I think, when I got invited to do a talk at the University of Memphis, and she was one of the graduate students in that department. We immediately hit it off. We stayed in contact. We're still in contact now. And we have had so many conversations about imposter syndrome, right? Like Selnisha's a Black feminist scholar. She's just a dynamite individual whom I care about deeply. And I remember her thinking, well, like, what if this chapter maybe doesn't fit? And I was like, girl, no, it's going to be the first chapter in the book. Like the notion of sanctuary, I mean, like home place, if we're building on bell hooks, right? Like Black feminist scholarship in her work and in so many others really is one of the main lifeblood lines of the book, right? And, Selnisha theorizes sanctuary and home in multiple ways, which is also then connected to joy and our feminist foreparents and those who came before us to help create the spaces for us to think about it now. And also thinking about your story about your abuela, right? Like now that I think about how our own elders have queered cultural scripts, gender scripts, etc. Like my grandma was twice divorced because her first two husbands, one of whom was my grandpa, was not the greatest person. Sorry, Mom, when you listen to this later, but there are family histories there, right? As there are in every family. She was twice divorced with 8 kids. She didn't even graduate from junior high, let alone high school or anything else. And she was thriving in all the ways. Like when I think about what it really means to be a strong woman who doesn't take anything from anyone, it was her. And like even the queering of conversations and performances, her living on the dance floor at our family parties, like what it means to be or have sanctuary is again another one of those questions, right? Like whether for certain individuals, sanctuary is the church. Maybe for us in higher ed, our sanctuary could be our coffee shop or our shared working spaces together. At conferences, sanctuary could be the dance floor again when we're like, we need a break from the conference. Yeah, vamos a bailar or something. And it's just another one of those so powerful perspectives that contributes, I think, to the richness of the book.
I really appreciate that you said, what if this chapter doesn't fit, right? And then you put it in the first chapter. And it makes me think of what sort of practices don't fit in contemporary models of mentorship. And it makes me then think of deviant mentorship. And just to indulge the listeners, right? This chapter argues that sometimes the best sort of mentorship practices are those that deviate from traditional routes of mentorship. And it's, these are in my work, actually, I have an upcoming piece where I refer this as calibrated disruption. And to me, this is a strategic disruption rooted in care, where, it's not a disruption for the sake of disruption, but it's some sort of like me showing and guiding my queer and trans students that you don't have to respond to violence. You can just wait for the response to be an institutional response on your behalf. And that has more weight. And there's this calibrated disruption of like grounding yourself in, and again, my piece is on intergenerational honey, because my grandmother was like, la miel atrae más que la hiel, right? So you attract more with honey. So, when you receive violence, right, or mentorship feels like violence, you kind of want to respond with the same amount of violence because you're hurt. And sometimes it's like, let's move out. Let's get away from this toxic environment and rethink and recalibrate how we respond and how we disrupt that practice altogether rather than just responding to it. Let's rethink this practice, right, as a learning moment. So yeah, this brings me really into this chapter of deviant mentorship. And if I'm thinking, right, that,
Wow.
as I was saying, I think of this as an intergenerational honey, right, of care and strategy passed across generations, not just from familial, right, practices, but also across faculty and students, right, and thinking of ourselves when we were students and the experiences we had. So with that, I want to ask you about the possibilities that you see in deviant mentorship, and how does it shift how we hold ourselves accountable as mentors?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So the chapter on deviant mentorship was co-written by a mentorship collaborative, Sam, Amanda, and Jenna. Jenna was the faculty member. Sam and Amanda were two of the graduate students. And their chapter, like you noted, asks for us to shift from thinking about feminist mentorship as an individual act, again, right, connected to mix ecological notion here too, to shift from the individual act to a network of support. And they build on Sarah Ahmed's discussion of troublemakers or making trouble, right, to ask us, the readers, to make trouble when practicing mentorship, reevaluating traditional mentorship approaches, and ultimately to just show up for each other, literally, right? For folks who have tenure, to show up and use that tenure and privilege in ways that other folks don't. For those who have full, to show up and use that institutional knowledge and support and power for those who are younger. And it really connects to your point so well of calibrated disruption, because disruption takes so many forms, right? And I can see your work being so helpful for several of my colleagues and graduate students. So I can't wait to share it when it comes out, because I've also been having conversations with folks where I tell them, like, you don't have to do everything all the time right now in response to everything, right? Disruption looks differently on different days. It's constrained to certain factors by the institution and the space you find yourself in. What can your body do right now in this moment? What are the short-term things and what are the long-term things, right? So in connection to their chapter on deviant mentorship, Tori and Lindsay's chapter on disrupting it, right? So we've got deviance, we've got outright disruption, again, to various degrees, is also asking for us to think about how sometimes, even to the best of our intentions and abilities, sometimes folks still replicate some of those problematic power structures or issues. And I think their two chapters together help give us language to think about the micro level and the macro level actions of changing mentorship, shifting it from the individual to the collective level, and thinking about what we can do on the daily and in the long term to help make that change progress further.
Yeah, so if deviant mentorship is asking us to make trouble,
Yeah,
it also raises the question, what comes next? What it would look like for institutions to embrace these practices, not just as words, but in action.
yeah. I think, I have so many thoughts on this. And this is also partially rooted in my own lived experience, having graduated with my PhD in 2014, working as a traveling educator because I'm a military spouse from 2014 to 2018, and then getting my first tenure track job in 2019. So there was like a 5-year gap between my PhD and my first tenure track job. So I have spent a lot of time as an independent scholar and on the tenure track thinking about this question. I think it impacts our experiences in so many ways, right? How do tenure policies think about mentorship labor in the tenure process? How does that get quantified or qualified? Like, can we advocate to make it more recognizable as being related to research and teaching and service, not just being relegated to the 10% of service that sometimes goes unseen, when really for many of us, it's like at 60% because of our identities and our experiences and relationships. I think it also asks for us to consider mentorship at multiple levels, not just in the traditional like vertical top-down way of like a senior scholar with a junior scholar or an advanced grad student with a new grad student, but thinking about it in more collective ways, right? Mentorship collaboratives and networks for research and writing and service and space. And I think it also puts pressure on the institution to really acknowledge the humanity and the holistic nature of our lives and our work, whether we are doing community engaged work, whether we are organizing in different spaces, whether we are running multiple grants in community engaged spaces, right? What does that look like? A huge part of my squawking over the last few years has been advocating, as one example, for book chapters to be more recognized in our tenure policies. And this isn't just relative to this institution. I mean, in the academic institution writ large, because so much of our mentorship and our collaboratives work in these chapters, especially when they have a hard time getting published in journals because maybe the work is too, quote, experimental, end quote, and not as traditional or as, quote, formal, end quote, as they might like. And that's just, I think, one of the micro level ways it shows that how if institutions writ large shifted how they think about mentorship, it could impact multiple offerings and multiple policies, not just for faculty members, but also to support like student parents and students who are taking care of maybe elderly parents, right? It impacts all of our lived experiences in multiple ways, I think.
Absolutely. So, Leah, where do you see feminist mentorship headed in the years ahead? And what do you hope, right, for students or early career scholars to carry with them after they read this book?
Yeah. For students and early career scholars, at a base level, I want them to know that there are scholars and mentors who care deeply about this. And I mean deeply. Folks who utilize holistic approaches, ethics of care and love, confianza, solidarity, to show up and do the work. And I know, we've talked about precarity a lot today, and I keep on thinking about precarity in response to this question because I also hope that we in our spaces continue to explore like what new theories and concepts we can use to give language and voice to mentorship, and also to keep showing up how is best and most needed to support those who need it most right now, right? Like I'm immediately thinking of our queer, trans, BIPOC, like loved ones and colleagues and siblings in this moment, and our students as well. But so many of our communities need support and help right now. So like, how can we take the conversation that we're having now, keep it going, and keep thinking about ways to like radically transform and apply it, right? Like of course, I'm thinking about Bell Hooks's book, Teaching to Transgress. And I've also been thinking a lot about the mentorship as transgression sort of metaphor and thought too, because our time right now is calling for it more than ever.
Absolutely. I want to turn back to you as co-editor. This book feels like a labor of love, but also one that must have taken a lot of energy and care. So my question is, what surprised, challenged, or sustained you the most in the process of bringing this collection together? And what's next for you in your own work on mentorship and pedagogy?
As I mentioned earlier, this book was connected to our other book, right? Feminist Mentoring in Academia. And when we released the call for book chapter proposals, we got so many that we had to split the book into two. One that is a slightly more like interpretive, quote, traditional, end quote, feminist book. And then ours, which is like the radical, queer, disruptive one, which is absolutely in line with the fact that I am first editor and like my ethos for the book on this one. This book was also rooted in a time of extreme burnout for me. And I'm very forthcoming about that because I always try to tell those that I love that they need to realize it before they're so far into the burnout that they can't come out of it. And I remember my spouse very lovingly telling me at one point in 2022, if you don't figure this out, we're going to have a problem and your health is going to have a problem, quite literally. And that was kind of my wake-up call. And he's like, you've got to get back into climbing. You've got to get back into weightlifting. You've got to get back into reading things that are not for higher ed because you are in the weeds, my dude. And I'm like, you're right, I am. What is going on? So in the process of all of this, what really sustained me was rock climbing and hiking, which is one of my things, going to a lot of concerts because I really love music. And to your question about what's sustained and what helped keep it going, it was really remembering why we were doing these projects in the first place, right? As I've mentioned before, co-edited books and projects for me are outlets for love, bridge building, mentorship, and connection in so many ways that many of us needed then, but that we still need now. And, Anna Louise Keating really captured that spirit in her foreword for the book without me even prompting her. I've never even spoken to her directly, but we wanted this book in her series because, as you could probably guess from the Comadrisma chapter, Sarah and I utilized so many Borderlands concepts and so many of those from Gloria Anzaldua's work specifically that having Anna Louise Keating as the editor for the series, who was Gloria Anzaldua's comadre, meant so much, right? So at the end of the day, in thinking about what's next, right? For me, Sarah, our colleague, Dr. Carlos Tarrin, and I are working on developing comadrisma in relation to queer world making, right? So thinking about that, more on that soon. I'm also working with a few incredible PhD students on building an oral history archive for the Salt Lake area Queer Climbers organization here at the Marriott Library at the U. And, here we're mentoring each other on how to do research, how to do oral history interviews, what it means to build an archive and do community engaged work. And if there's one thing I'll always be doing, regardless of where I am or what I'm working on, it's always focusing on those bridges, right? And Gloria Anzaldúa has this one quotation that the first time I read it, it really made me gasp. And she says, Voyager, there are no bridges. One builds them as one walks, right? So whatever I'm doing at whatever point, it's probably drinking some coffee and building some bridges, right? Working on those mentorship relationships along the way.
Absolutely. And as I actually remind my students, there are some bridges that lead to nowhere.
Yes.
And it's okay to burn those bridges.
Oh, preach.
That's one of those
So
calibrated disruptions.
Yes.
So, Leah, I just want to thank you so much for your words, your time and care that you put into this collection, along with your co-editors. What I carry from this conversation is that mentorship is lived, embodied, and political. It's about sanctuary, right? About naming desires and needs, about building networks of care that helps us not just survive, but thrive.
Yeah, that's the goal.
And I hope the listeners leave with the invitation to practice mentorship differently, grounded in reciprocity, care, and injustice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Romy.
The invitation.
You've been listening to the Virtual Jewel Box. Our music is by Jelly Roll Morton, Perfect Rag. Thanks for joining us.